وذكر فإن الذكرى تنفع المؤمنين.
If you look on the verse 41, just about the prayer, I think this is really interesting. It's on page 1020. It says, seest thou not that it is Allah who praises all beings, whose praises all beings in the heavens. I have a problem with these kind of translations. I'm just going to do my own here. Haven't you seen that it is Allah that all beings are praising, from the birds in the heavens and the earth, وَطَيْرُ صَافَّاتٍ, and even the birds in flying, and everything knows its prayer. قَدْ عَلِمَ صَلَاتَهُ كُلٌّ قَدْ عَلِمَ صَلَاتَهُ وَتَسْبِيحَهُ. Every creature knows his prayer and his praise. So this is really interesting in the idea that every creature is in an act of worship, and it knows how to do that. The bird knows how it's supposed to praise, right? And so for the Muslims, when they look at creatures, they really see that these creatures are all glorifying God and have a prayer that they're doing. So, the praying mantis has its prayer. The cat has its prayer. I mean, you can see the cat in a state of meditation, when it's there just purring away and doing, it goes into a really interesting state. And in fact, Zen Buddhists, traditionally talk about the cat and its meditative state. That you can learn Zen from a cat. If you want to learn how to do Zazen, you watch a cat. And then that the human being is somebody who does not by nature know his prayer, that the prayer is something that is taught. And this relates because the human being is a creature that has intellect, that has consciousness, that it is not inspired, or there's not an intuitive. Although many people will feel some type of desire to pray, and will pray, and many people even outside of traditions in this culture at some time in their life will attempt to pray. For the Muslim point of view, there is a way of praying, and that way involves the body. And there is an importance of the idea of being in the body when one prays, because the Muslims have always really avoided a type of Cartesian dualism of mind-body. And we believe in the bodily resurrection. Although we do see that the soul is connected to the body, and the soul does disengage from the body. And in fact, the Muslims believe, according to the Qur'an, that the soul even disengages during sleep, that there is a disengagement that takes place. But there is an idea that the body is also part, that we should not deny our bodies. In fact, the body is part of our being and does represent a very important aspect of our nature. And so the prayer is a physical prayer as well as being a spiritual prayer, that the body itself is being used as an act of worship. And so there is a standing, and then there's a bowing, and then a return, and then a prostration. And each of the limbs is participating in that. In fact, the 7 limbs, Hakim talked about that, the 7 limbs. And then there's an idea of putting the forehead, right, and the nose onto the ground, literally onto the ground. And the act of this, there's a symbolic act, which is elevating the heart over the intellect. That there is an idea that in the act of worship, that we are submitting the intellect and we are elevating the heart, because the heart, according to the Muslims, is the organ of cognition, and what it was created to do was to come to know God. It was to come to know God. So that this is just, this is something some of the scholars have mentioned. It's not really, it's just a symbolic type of. And then the prayer that I didn't mention here was the afternoon prayer. At the point that the sun reaches a point where the shadow will cast the like of a thing plus whatever the shadow at the meridian point was. So most people, if you measure your height to your feet, the vast majority of people, what they call the 2 standard deviations, right? 95% of people are going to come between 6.5 to 7 feet of their height if you have normal foot size to your height. So if you literally lie down and put a quarter at the tip of your head and something at your feet, and then you see and measure it, and you go 1, 2, 3, you'll find that your height will generally be about 7 feet. And so for the Muslim, traditional Muslims measured the sun with their body, which is again using the body as an act of worship, because measuring the sun's shadow is considered an act of worship. It's part of remembrance of God. And so you would go out, if you knew, for instance, like right now, for me, the meridian, the Dhuhr prayer is my shadow is about 2 feet. So I would add to that 7. So when my shadow reaches 9 feet, Asr time has come in, this prayer. So I go out at about 5 o'clock and I measure it, and I'll find it's 9 feet. That means I can pray Asr. All right, so that is the afternoon prayer. So those are the 5 prayers: the sunset, the evening prayer, which is called Isha, the dawn prayer, which is called Fajr, which literally means dawn, and then the post-meridian prayer, which is called Dhuhr. So those are the prayers. That's the first pillar. What you will do, or the second pillar, not including the Shahada. What you will do is you will 5 times a day stop everything. In Muslim countries, traditionally, people left their shops. I mean, this is less so now because Muslims are being secularized like everybody else. But traditionally, and you can still find this in some countries, Muslims will leave their shops. Oftentimes they didn't lock them. They would literally put drapes, because for somebody to steal while somebody was praying, even a thief had a sense of honor there, right? That was not a good thing to do. And it's interesting that traditionally many court cases were decided based on what's called an oath, where the judge would say, do you swear by God that you're telling the truth or lying? Historically, many court cases were solved because people were quite literally afraid of bearing false witness or lying in that, and they would say, I can't say that. And that would literally end the trial. Many cases like that historically. So traditionally people did have a sense, that there were certain things, even the thief had honor. There's a famous story of Imam al-Ghazali, great theologian and scholar, who studied he's from Tus in Persia, and he'd studied in one of the great Persian cities, and he had spent 2 years transcribing all these books by hand, because this people, there weren't printing presses. You wanted books, you had to write them out. He went to the library, spent 2 years doing that, and on the way back, their caravan was attacked by brigands, and they were taking his books, and al-Ghazali begged this chief of the thieves, you can't take all my knowledge. And the thief laughed, and he said, what kind of knowledge do you have when somebody like me can steal it? And al-Ghazali said that he realized that God had made him say that, to let him know and to remind him that true knowledge was not in books. All right. What's that? Yeah, that's it. What's that? The 5th prayer, let's see, you would have Maghrib, Isha, Fajr, Dhuhr, and Asr is the last prayer, Asr. And that means the afternoon prayer. Now, just to let you know what, the Muslims are encouraged to congregate for the prayer, but they don't have to. It's very highly encouraged to congregate. Women can go to the mosque and congregate if they like or if they don't. It's not encouraged for them. The house is actually where the women generally pray in most Muslim cultures. And I will just make mention of certain phenomena that you relate. Traditionally, there was no barrier between the men and the women praying. That is a later innovation. It was not the tradition of the Prophet. The Prophet did not have a barrier between the men and the women. That came later. In many Muslim countries, you still do not have that barrier. For instance, African countries, North Africa, you do not have that barrier. In the Middle East, in the Indo-Pak cultures, you will tend to find barriers. So that is more of a cultural phenomenon. It is not a religious, it's not part of the religious tradition. Even this, what they call the masharabiyya in the mosque here, which is this a latticed woodwork between the men and the women, that is not traditional. That is, well, it's traditional in terms of Muslim culture, but it is not from the religion. The religion does not say that. That is something that people introduced as a cultural phenomenon. So, and that's important to remember. And there are some countries that, you know, I think a few where there's an extreme patriarchy there, and, you know, women, it's really hard for them to pray in the mosque. And that again is a cultural phenomenon because the Prophet prohibited that. He said, do not prohibit women from going to the mosques. And it's a sound hadith. I think probably on the Arabian Peninsula, you will find in some of the mosques in the villages. In Mecca and Medina, definitely not. There are women praying there. Mecca, you'll look here, the black are generally the women. In the pictures, if you see of Mecca, the Kaaba, when you see big black groupings, those are generally the women, and the white are the men, right? Because in that country, they tend to wear black and white. The men wear white, the women wear black. In Algeria, the women wear white. So that again is a cultural thing of color. In West Africa, where Dr. Nyang is from, women they're like cockatoos, you know, they're very, very colorful. Lot of color in their hijab. And Morocco, it's pretty much almost like a basic kind of unisex type. They wear a jalaba, and the differences would be in the colors, but the actual jalaba is very similar. The women wear the same dress as the men do, except the colors distinguish. So,
The communities that do this gender separation, do they think of it and explain it as being Islam?
I think mostly they do. I think most of them do. You know, and you get, you know, I mean, patriarchy is a phenomenon worldwide, and we are as susceptible to it as any other culture. I think there's been a lot of artificial mechanisms at trying to break it down, but nonetheless, you know, there's still a lot of remnants. I'll give you some examples. In Muslim law, and Ruqayya is going to talk about this, but in Muslim law, a woman does not have to serve her husband in her house, and she cannot be forced to. If she refuses to cook, the man has to provide somebody who will cook, or he has to cook himself. She is highly encouraged to do that, but it is literally within the Islamic law that she has a right to say, I don't want to cook. Right? It's based on the hadith and based on the scholars' interpretation. But this is literally 1400 years ago when these judgments were being pronounced. You know, that women, the money is theirs. If a woman earns money, she can actually go to a qadi. If the husband takes the money from her, she has a right to go to a qadi, and because it's a crime. It's not his money. Any money that comes into hers is hers, whereas the money that the man earns, a portion of it has to go to the woman by law. So it's very interesting. You know, I think that you know, the phenomenon of the abuse of certain characteristics that the man, certainly physical, which is changing in this country, but generally in most societies, men tend to be physically stronger and have been able to coerce women physically to do things. And there's a very interesting verse in the Qur'an, which is about Asya, the wife of Pharaoh, when she says, "Oh God, save me from my husband, the tyrant." And I just find that's really fascinating that's a dua. You know, it's a prayer in the Qur'an from a woman about her husband who's a tyrant, being asked to be saved from him. And I just wonder historically, you know, how many women that has been a type of, you know, sustenance for that type, you know, in this culture as well. I mean, we still have very serious problems with domestic violence, and we tend to really look at the public space and not so much, we forget about the private space, about a lot of mental cruelty, it's all still going on. But there's a type of openness that has emerged in the culture where these things, people can talk about them. Mauritania, where Sheikh Abdullah's from, we were talking about this, about domestic violence and things like that. And it's interesting that in Mauritania, it's impossible for a man to hit a woman. It's literally impossible. One, because of tribe. In other words, marital relationships are they're very related to the family. And so for there to be any injustices towards the woman, it's going to affect very heavily on relationships, inter-family relationships and things like that. And the women generally tend to be very educated from his group particularly, and know their rights, and they're strong women. There's also no polygamy in that culture at all, because the women put a condition in their marriage contracts, I don't want a second wife. And they know that's a right that they have. Right? They can stipulate that in a contract, and they do that. Absolutely. It's from the scholar's understanding and interpretation, that there are early community instances where that was from the companions, where that was established. Did somebody ask a question?
Yes, I did. Could you speak a little bit about the ablution?
Ablution?
The cleansing, I guess.
Okay, good point about the prayer. There is a water cleansing, ablution. I hate that word. I don't know where that comes from, ablution. Ritual ablutions. It's a Latin word, but I just don't like it. It's Catholic, do you think? Is it?
It's used in the Catholic Church.
It is, isn't it? Yeah, I think that's where they got. It's always bothered me, that word. I just don't like the way it sounds. It sounds like something bad. Ablution. Brother, do your ablutions. Right? There is a water purification, a ritual purification with water before you pray. You should use a small amount of water. It's not meant to waste water. It's actually encouraged to use a small amount. And it's basically a washing of the face, the arms up to the elbows, a wiping of the head, not a washing, just a light wiping, and then a cleansing of the feet. And the idea is to enter into a ritual state. All religious traditions have this idea of entering into a ritual state of purity before you go into the divine space. And that's the idea there. And the proof that it is ritual and not related to actual physical type, although it does have physical qualities, is that you can use earth to do it in the absence of water. So you use the earth. The Prophet Muhammad said that the earth was given to my community as a place of worship, the entire earth, that we can worship anywhere on the earth, and as a purification, that the earth is seen as a source of purification. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said in a tradition related by Tabarani, he said, beware of your mother, the earth, that you should transgress or oppress her, because she will bear witness against all of those who have transgressed against her. And there is an idea in the Islamic tradition, literally the Prophet Muhammad said that the entire earth is raised up on the Yawm al-Qiyamah, on the Day of Judgment, and will bear witness. And the Prophet Muhammad said that rocks will bear witness, that trees will bear witness, that rivers will bear witness against those who did harm to them without just cause. Right?
Is there a tradition of ritual cleansing for women after their menstrual cycle?
There is, like in the Jewish tradition, yeah. A woman is considered ritually impure during the menstrual cycle, and she does not pray during that period, right? Because that is a cleansing time. She does not pray during that period. She's absolved from the prayer, and there's no stigma related to it. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad, because in some of the Orthodox Jewish tradition, the woman is, the man stays away. Yeah, she's separate. The Prophet knew, because there were Jews living in Medina, and he wanted to break that tradition, and it's recorded that he recited the Qur'an while on the lap of his wife Aisha while she was menstruating. And he was letting people know that there's nothing wrong with the woman during that time. It's just a period of personal purification, and it does not extend beyond her. She can cook, like she's allowed to cook during that time. She's allowed to, in fact, even foreplay is allowed during that time between a male and a female. But the Prophet said, avoid what is between the belly button and the knee. In other words, don't because that's a time when it's prohibited for actual sexual intercourse. But the Prophet said that is a time when male and female could have like foreplay, sexual foreplay, with the exclusion of intercourse only. So, any questions now, just about all that's transpired?
Was there a number of times, repetitions for the ablutions?
Good, yeah. 3 is encouraged. 1 is what's obligatory, and 3 is encouraged. No more than 3. It would be discouraged after.
Is there anything to the notion that certain sects wash their hands from the hands to the elbow and others from the elbow?
No. One way. There's one way to do it, which is down like that. I mean, pretty much all the schools are the same on the wudu and the prayer. The prayer, there's some difference, like Maliki school prays with hands at the side, and also the Shia pray with their hands at the side. The other schools pray with the hands here or here, some up here. So you're going to get slight variations, but the basic movements are the same. And some will move their finger to concentrate in the last part of the prayer, and some won't.
Do they do the left hand first and then the right?
Right hand, always right to left. In the Muslim tradition, left, you know, it's cosmological. Left, I mean, in Latin, sinistra is left, right? There's always this idea that left is kind of sinister, it's the bad side. In the Muslim tradition, it's not like that. There's not a stigma like that about left hand. Like in Europe, there was a stigma related to being left-handed. And people, I mean, my mother she went to Catholic schools. She was left-handed. She got the ruler until she learned to write with her right hand, which now we know is actually damages. That's, you know, one of the things that some people think are result in learning disabilities and things like that, because there's a confusion that takes place in the body as a result of that. But in the Muslim tradition, there's no stigmatism related. Like, I'm left-handed. Omar ibn al-Khattab he wrote with his left hand. There's no stigmatism attached to that. But people are supposed to eat with their right hand. The left hand is used for cleaning, like the urine and cleaning the feces, right? So the right hand is used. That's why you would never shake with your left hand. You would always shake with your right hand. So in Muslim cultures, the right hand is very important. And one of the reasons that the thief loses the right hand is it's when they break there's a deep breach of the social contract when a human being steals from another human being, and there is literally a severing from the society that takes place. So to lose the right hand is a very traumatic experience in the Muslim culture.
Is there any linguistic parallel between the right hand, the word right, and the word law, as there is in a number of them?
Absolutely, yeah. Right, yameen, means, it's like an oath is called swearing, a yameen, right? I swear that this is true. You're swearing with the right. And also yuman is a good omen, and sha'am, which is related to the left, is a bad omen. So there is a cosmology involved in it. And also the idea in classical cosmology, which is Indo-European as well as Chinese. In the Chinese cosmology, the south is yang, which is over, and the north is yin, which is under. The same in the Indic, the Dravidian culture and the Indic cultures, that the word for south is in Sanskrit relates to over or above, and the word for north is under. And classically, maps were generally put the south on the top. And you will notice out there that Al-Idrisi's map puts Africa on the top and Europe on the bottom. There was a switch with the European cartographers when they kind of realized that there's some philosophical implications here, being under or inferior as opposed to being over and superior, and they literally switched the maps around. But the book that a lot of European cartography was based upon was the Book of Roger, which was done by Al-Idrisi for the Sicilian king of Sicily, Roger, and he had his maps with the south on the top, which is related to facing the east in the morning. So the back is called Gharb, or the unknown, which is west. The east is called the Mashriq, or facing the radiance of the sun. The south is called the right, like Yemen means the right. It's also the southernmost place in the Arabian Peninsula. And Shamal is from north, which is from Shimal, which means left. So north is considered left to the human body. In terms of this is cosmological. in terms of cosmology. So the north would be under the south. And the Muslims traditionally did their astrolabes with the south as the projection was from the south, looking up to the sky. Any other questions?
You said earlier that in some countries or cultures it's difficult for the Muslims to be reflective about their religion. And I was wondering if you could enumerate some of the reasons why it's difficult to do.
Well, because I think people in the Muslim culture, it's just a given that you're right. You know, like it used to be that way in this culture. You know, it was just given. Christianity was true. Everything else is false. That's just a given of any culture that has a dominant religious teaching that still has power and influence. And certainly Islam is still in that position in the Muslim world, where to question or to really think, why am I a Muslim? You know, other than the fact that I was born here, that most people won't come to that.
There would be judgment.
There would be social stigma, for one. But see, I don't even think that should negate. Even if there was, it's still important to reflect and think. You know, I mean, you have always had people within cultures that have questioned things. I mean, there were always people in the Christian tradition that remained Christians, but they could still challenge the culture. Sometimes they were burnt at the stake, other times they weren't. But the point is that there were people that would say, you know, is this right? Or is what we're doing right? I mean, that's an important human question. And this is just a lot of non-reflective people. And then I think there's a lot of encouragement for the absence of reflection for social political reasons. You know, I mean, in this country, you know, we're a country of entertainment. People know massive things about sports and basketball and baseball and football, and adults that can give you brilliant analyses of, you know, why this team's going to make it to the Super Bowl and have all their stats at hand, and they don't have a clue about the national debt or why we're paying over 50% of our tax dollar to interest on our national debt, or why our schools are literally crumbling before our eyes, why there's children killing children. Why, you know, really, there's just not a lot of emphasis on analyzing, on thinking, on seeing. So, you know, we're as much, I think, you know, the Americans, we tend to delude ourselves often. I mean, you're all educated people, so it's probably not the case, but there's certainly a lot of people out there that really haven't given a lot of thought, that they're much more obsessed with, you know, the latest entertainment, what the latest movie is out there, you know. The Romans controlled their societies with bread and circus, right? Bread and circus. It's a very common political way of maintaining
What's the specific rationale behind prohibition of eating pork?
Of pork? Okay, rationale, there are two things in the Sharia that are understood by the Muslims. One is that there are some things that we know why, and there are other things that we don't. The things that we know why with absolute certainty are those things that we're told in the Qur'an or in the Hadith that that's why it was prohibited. For instance, in the Qur'an it says, do not go near sexual perversions because they are foulness and they lead down a terrible road. So illicit sexual relations, the idea is that they will lead down a terrible road. There's a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad that perversity will never manifest in a people except they're afflicted with diseases and illnesses that were unknown to previous generations. So the Muslims would see that, you know, that breaching sexual laws that are given by God from the Muslim perspective there are consequences. In other words, that the moral realm has laws that impact us at the biological, at the psychosocial level, just as there are physical laws of cause and effect and things like that. Right? So Muslims see that morality is not this arbitrary thing, that there is a reason, right? And this is the way the Muslims view it. And I think a lot of Christians have that feeling too. I mean, a lot of Christians point out that if you are monogamous, you will not, you know, if two people who are both virgins enter into a marital situation and do not breach those boundaries, they're not susceptible to venereal diseases. It is a simple fact of biology, right? So that's at one level. Now the other level is that there are things that we don't know why God has said don't do this. And the reason that the scholars say is that there are some things that he has not told us is because it's, one, a test, that will you do it even though your intellect is not fully capable of comprehending the wisdom behind it, and two, that it's an aspect of submission again. Now, the scholars have always encouraged seeking reasons, wisdoms to increase people's faith, but never to say as an absolute, this is why. Concerning pig, generally pig has been considered an unclean animal. It eats unclean things. Its form is it's an unclean form. And you know, some modern Jews, like Reformed Jewish tradition, some of them who've gone to very liberal positions have pointed out, you know, this was really for trichinosis and diseases that related to, but now that we know scientifically, and they would actually consider it acceptable to eat pig. The Muslims would never go to that.
Why is shellfish not prohibited?
Shellfish is discouraged according to Imam Abu Hanifa. But the reason that it is not prohibited is because there is a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad that what comes out of the sea is pure and halal for you. And that's where it comes from. But Abu Hanifa did consider it makruh to eat shellfish, because it ate unclean things. And that was the reason that he gave. So that is a position, but it's not a dominant position. And again, one of the things that the Qur'an mentions is part of the Prophet's message was to lighten the load of the previous dispensations. So there are actually some lightening of loads concerning what was binding on the Jewish tradition, because from the point that people were getting weaker at maintaining the guidelines of God. And so there was kind of making it easier for people for this last stage of human existence, because people do not have the same spiritual capacities as the ancients did. So there's that idea as well. Any other questions about this? So we'll go on to the next pillar, which is zakat. The word zakat means, it comes from a root word which means to purify. And the idea is that it is a purification of your wealth. Everybody in accruing wealth will have some either clearly doubtful or even really doubtful aspects to the accruement of wealth. So the idea is that zakat is a way of purifying your wealth. And the Prophet Muhammad prohibited the taking of zakat for his own family. They cannot be recipients of zakat, Bani Hashim. The reason is that he said that zakat is like the feces of wealth. In other words, the body needs to let go of its impurities in order to maintain its purity. And zakat is seen as a letting go of one's wealth in order to purify and make the wealth that it has grow, literally.
Yeah, how do they then turn that around to the recipient who receives this?
The recipient who receives the wealth, for the person it is a purification.
Yes.
For the one receiving the wealth, it is a right. It's seen as a right. And so it changes perspective. There's a shift in perspective. In other words, the one receiving it is not receiving anything filthy. Right? It's a right. And it's encouraged when you give zakat to somebody to not tell them it's zakat, so that they don't feel, to give it as a gift, so that they don't feel, because some people have a pride, they don't want to feel like they're like a welfare type state that I need, that it's encouraged. You don't have to tell them it's zakat. It's also encouraged to give it smiling with as seeing that it's an honor. So the person giving it, these are in the books of fiqh related to giving zakat, that you're supposed to give it in humility, not in arrogance. That you give it to the person literally feeling like you're honored to do that thing. And the Prophet said one of the signs of the end of time is people will consider zakat like a fine. In other words, they wouldn't see it as an honor, but rather as like taxes nowadays, right? Have to pay it.
Clearly both parties involved, both sides know kind of what's going on. But, I mean, don't they have an understanding of, I mean, like say it's...
I've given zakat many times in which the people had no idea that it was zakat.
Oh, really?
Absolutely, many times.
How would, like, is there any example that you can give of, like, how would that...
Well, Muslims, I think you'd be really surprised at the generosity of Muslims that are practicing to other Muslims. They're very generous. If within a community, like in my community, for instance, we had a man who recently lost his job, and I found out about it, and I knew that he was in a hard condition. I contacted a few people, and in one day we raised $4,000, and I gave that to that person, right, just to help him for the next couple months until he could get a job again. And I didn't tell him. I said, this a gift, Now there were people that gave it as zakat, but I didn't, I don't have to tell them it's zakat.
There are times when you'll find things on your doorstep.
That's true.
You may find a bag of lamb, you may find an envelope of money, and you don't know who.
Very common in the Muslim community. There's definitely, I think Muslims do still have a sense of taking care. Like things like homelessness in the Muslim world, those are still real shocking. Like the other day we saw a man, and I was with Sheikh Abdullah, and he didn't have a shirt on. And he asked me first if he was crazy. Because in their country, you would never not wear a shirt in public. It would literally be, for them, it's a sign somebody was mad. And the same with shorts. That's something he hasn't, I don't think he's quite grasped it yet. Just because their culture is still very, very modest. But we told him that he's probably homeless, and he said, "What does that mean?" And he literally didn't know what it meant, because in that country you could they just build like they take tree limbs, and the women will sew like burlap sacks together and make a little house, and you don't have to pay property tax, and you don't have to, you just set up shop. And he didn't have a concept of like being homeless, and then he just said to me, with all of this, like, there's so much here, because he's coming from a place where there's nothing. And he said, how is it that like somebody could be without a place to sleep? With all, like, it was something that I don't think his intellect really could quite grasp, right? Very kind of interesting. Really interesting book to read about this is Winners and Losers in the New World Order by Jacques Attali, right? He talks about this phenomenon of increasingly people becoming accustomed to planetary boat people. That's what he calls them. Planetary boat people. Where you'll go to the ATM and the bum's there, and we just become inured to it because it just becomes more and more difficult for people to deal with them.
How is the giving of zakat in relationship to whether the receiver is Muslim or not?
The receiver, that's a good question. Let me tell you and I'm going to get to that. Let me tell you basically, zakat is a local tax. It is not meant to go outside of the community. The Prophet said those closest to you are most worthy of your help. So the idea of acting locally is really important. That if you're fighting for the rights of the Tibetans, and your own community, there's people oppressed, the Muslims would see that as a kind of disconnection. It doesn't mean that you're not sympathetic with something happening over there, but the thing is you begin at home. You begin cleaning up your own home. So zakat goes back to the wealth of the local community. If there was no one in that community that is impoverished or needs zakat, then it will go outside of the community. And you first give to your relatives who are in need before you would give to strangers. Now, the recipients of zakat, there are 8 categories mentioned in the Qur'an itself, and those are considered the only recipients of zakat. One of the only non-Muslim group are what are called mu'allafat qulubuhum, which are people who are very close to Islam. They're very interested in Islam, they're close to Islam. Those people, it's permissible to give them zakat money. If they're not Muslim, then you can donate money to them, but you cannot give zakat. Zakat is the right of poor Muslims. In other words, the idea that you take care of your own before you go outside. But traditionally, the Muslims In the early 19th century, during a famine in France, the Bey of Tunis and Algeria sent wheat to Europe to help relieve the famine. So traditionally the Muslims did have a concept of helping other peoples if they had a surplus. But first you help the people within your community. And then also Jewish, there's a beautiful story of Sayyidina Omar, because Jewish and Christian and non-Muslim peoples like Buddhists and others pay a tax to live under the Muslims. And Omar saw a Jewish man begging, an old man, and he said, "Why is this man begging?" And they said, "He doesn't have any money." And he said, "We took money from him when he was young, so we should take care of him in his old age." And so he demanded that Christian and Jews and other people, if they had no one within their community to take care of them, then there should be money taken out of what's called the Bayt al-Mal, or the collective bank of the Muslim government, to help those people. And it's interesting that during the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz in Damascus, the government actually paid for and supplied people, not dogs, but people to take care of blind people as an employment, right, which is mentioned in the books.
Is there a certain percentage then that they make?
Good question. The percentage is, there are three types of zakat. Income tax is prohibited in Islam. You cannot tax people for income that they're using to live by. You can only tax them according to standing wealth that 1 year has accumulated. So if a year has passed and you still have the wealth, that's what you pay zakat on. You don't pay zakat based on what you made that year. So if I made $50,000, but at the end of the year I have zero, which is the case of a lot of people in this country, right? And they actually have to borrow to pay the IRS. That you do not pay any zakat. You pay zakat at the end of a lunar year. You pay zakat on what you have that a year has transpired with. And you pay 1/40th. 2.5%. No, of the entire thing. So if I had $40, I would pay $1. After the whole year, yes. Yeah, it's not a big amount. But if, go ahead.
You may only need, let's say, a $6,000 car to get around. Wants and needs.
Right.
I mean, you may only need, let's say, a $6,000 car to get around.
But you buy a $100,000 one.
Exactly.
Okay. Herb asked, I think, a good question. Where does want and need come into this? In other words, if I'm a wealthy person and I buy a car for $100,000, and I'm a poor person, I buy one for $500. Can I just spend my money on that? Yes. Wealthy people, their money is discretionary. It is highly discouraged to waste, and it is actually prohibited to be grossly extravagant. But the Prophet Muhammad said, Allah loves to see the traces of His blessings on His creatures. And so it's encouraged for a wealthy person to dress, not extravagantly. He should wear things in order to show the blessing on him. And there's a beautiful book called Envy Towards a Social Theory. Fascinating book about the disruptive aspects of envy in a culture. And one of the worst things in Islam is envy. It's literally considered one of the worst things. It's one of the 7 deadly sins in the Christian Catholic tradition. My father was Catholic, and he said that he's unfortunately familiar with about 4 of them. And his friend told him, one's enough to kill you. But envy is one of the 7 deadly sins, right? In our Western tradition. In the Islamic tradition, it's also one of the real bad things. And so the idea is that poor people should not envy rich people. It's really considered a bad thing to envy rich people. Poor people should thank God. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad said, in terms of your worldly condition, always look to people below you. And in terms of your otherworldly condition, always look at people better than you. So in terms of righteousness, piety, look at people that are superior to you, that you might never become deluded about yourself and you always want to improve. But in terms of the material world, look at people worse off than you so that you feel grateful for what you have.
What was the book that you said was, you mentioned the effect of envy?
Yeah, it's called Envy Towards a Social Theory, and it's a German author, and I can't remember his name right now. I actually just got the book a couple months ago, and so I don't have the author's name.
If there's no income tax and zakat is determined on somebody's net,
it's like a capital gains tax more. It's like capital at the end of the year.
Okay, does the zakat satisfy and fulfill the needs of the poor? Is it their poor due?
There is a scholar in Qatar who has proven that if zakat was paid in the Muslim world, there would be a gross surplus of wealth today. It's very interesting because there's also zakat of agriculture and livestock. So agriculture has 1/5. Now the World Bank estimated that if 2% of the world's agricultural crops were taxed, 2%, that there would be no hunger anywhere. Now Islam says 5% for irrigation that you did yourself, 10% for agriculture based on natural irrigation like rain and things like that. So if you didn't work, you pay more. If you did irrigation, you pay less. So 10% of wheat, corn, barley, all of these grains is taxed, and it's supposed to be given and then distributed to the poor. Also livestock. So for every 5 camels, 1 sheep is given. Like that, right? 30 cows, a calf. 40,
Question, you were talking about the livestock, and I was just thinking about Saudi Arabia, and all the pilgrimage, when all these people come and they wish to make sacrifices.
Right.
How do they deal with it?
They can them and they send them around to poor people around the world. That's what they do now. The meat that's sacrificed during the Hajj, and no, I didn't sacrifice. You don't have to sacrifice if you made there's 3 ways of making Hajj. And I made it the way that the Prophet ﷺ made it, where it's not obligatory to sacrifice. You can if you want to. I did not sacrifice. But if you do sacrifice, the meat can either be eaten there, it's encouraged to distribute it amongst the poor. And the Eid, the reason it's encouraged to sacrifice during the Eid traditionally was that poor people generally did not eat meat very often. And so the idea was on the Eid, it was a time when you brought meat to the poor people to give them meat. Now meat is becoming more increasingly cheaper, and so you're finding people are meat eaters all over. Sayyidina Omar said, beware of meat because it has the addiction of wine. And he also said to one man who used to eat meat every day, every time you desire meat, you buy it? And he said, yes. And he said, I'm afraid you're going to be from the people who lose all their good deeds in this world. In other words, that you enjoy the world so much that you can't show the right gratitude. So it was not encouraged to eat meat all the time. And now Muslims have become heavy meat eaters, but traditionally most Muslim cultures were really more semi-vegetarian cultures. It's kind of more of a recent phenomenon, the heavy meat. And beef is very new in the Muslim world. Traditionally Muslims were not beef eaters. They were goat and sheep.
In Muslim cultures, where, particularly in the 20th century, where there's been, say, oil discovery and wealth, how has that affected zakat? Is it causing problems between?
That's a really good point. Yeah, there is a lot of problems. There's a lot of resentment. There's a lot of envy, things like that. But technically, buried wealth, there's different opinions about it. Most of the scholars say that it goes to the Muslim collective bank, what's called the Bayt al-Mal, and it should be used to develop the Muslim communities, to help the poor, to build schools, to do these things. It should not be personal wealth. Some say that no, 20%. It should be taxed 20%, and then the land of the people that it was found on, they're the ones that benefit from it. So there are some differences of opinion, but there's definitely, in many of the countries where there's been natural resources discovered, and the Muslims do have a lot of natural resources in the Muslim communities. There's just been a gross expropriation of the wealth and exploitation of it, which is very unfortunate. And there's also been a lot of outside influences. I mean, we know when Mossadegh, who was the prime minister of Iran, wanted to nationalize the oil, there was a CIA coup that ousted him. So there's hands outside that are also impacting very seriously how the wealth is being used. People, if you know about petrodollars, then you know the fact that the vast majority of petro wealth is literally being supplanted and invested in Western banks, and the Western banks in turn are using that to finance a lot of the projects in the quote-unquote third world, which end up causing major problems because of interest payment and things like that. So very complicated world conditions, but I think they're really worthwhile bringing up to your students, because we have to, as communities, we just have to start thinking about this stuff. We're so marginalized from these dialogues, and I think just normal people should be participating in trying to understand what's going on. Why are countries like Mexico, paying these massive interests to, there's more interest now coming out of the third world than there is aid going into it. So there's a lot of very serious contradictions going on, and then a lot of the massive projects that are being developed, the World Bank and the IMF encouraging these gross projects, the dam now in China and Brazil and these type of things that really, if you read somebody like Suzanne George, really worth reading. Fate Worse Than Debt, Ill Fares the Land, How the Other Side Dies. She worked for the World Bank and then kind of reneged and realized that she felt that they were doing a lot more harm than good. And she's written some really, really worthwhile critiques. And not from a kind of conspiratorial type, just really kind of analyzing the thing. I think Suzanne George, she works now, I think she's supported by the Catholic Church, actually, one of their organizations.
You said there are 8 types of zakat. There are 8 recipients. There are 3 types of zakat. Can you run through?
Poor people. By definition, there are 2 types of poor people. One is called miskeen, and the other is called faqir in the Qur'an. The miskeen is the one who doesn't even have a day's worth of their livelihood. The poor one is somebody who does not have a year's supply. They do not have enough money to get through a year, and they are accepted as a recipient for. Yeah, that's a good point. If the person is known to use things, like if they're alcoholic or known to do things, then yeah, you should not support people that you know the money is going to go, and there are more worthy people for it. That is encouraged to look for the more worthy people. And then you have the people who collect it. So there is a portion of it taken out to employ the zakat collectors. And then you have indebted people who are in debt. And that is a type of debt as long as it was not accrued through wrong actions like gambling. And it is a debt in which they're in serious trouble. The debt has reached a level where socially they're really being jeopardized. And then you have and also indentured servants, people who bonds people. Because in Islam, traditionally, although this doesn't exist anymore in the Muslim world, traditionally there were people who were bondspeople that were under the yoke of somebody. And those people in Sharia, if they desire to be freed from that yoke, then they have a right to zakat to pay off whatever their worth is, right? And so that's a group. And then also so that's 5. And then you have and then you have people, the Ibn Sabil, who is somebody who's traveling, and this is also pre-ATM, because he can be a wealthy person as well. So it's somebody who's traveling and they were robbed, and they're far away from their home and they don't have access. And it still happens because ATM isn't, right? 80% of the world still doesn't have telephones, by the way, right? So Here we forget about that, right? But it's for somebody who was traveling and they lost their wealth. Those people are asked, they're permitted to get to receive the zakat. And then for people who are called mu'allafat qulubuhum, which are either near Islam or they have just come into Islam, and you can give them zakat as a way of binding their hearts to the community. And then the last group is fi sabilillah, which are people who are defending the homelands. So anybody who is defending, like jihad, like the Bosnians, when they were fighting, many people sent their zakat to Bosnia or Afghanistan, for instance, right? And there are many people, I think, that support the Palestinians, viewing that as a valid, struggle, things like that. So that's basically those are the recipients according to the Qur'an.
I would think that the answer to this would be no, but if you're an American Muslim and you're paying 35% income tax, you also pay 2.5% wealth tax?
Absolutely. In fact, more so. Some of the scholars have said if you're giving 35% to the American government, which is using a lot of it for things that you should probably give another 35% just to counterbalance, and then pay zakat on top of that. A lot of Muslims have a lot of cognitive dissonance about taxes in this country, particularly immigrants who, their countries are, there's just a lot of problems going on, and they feel there's a lot of cognitive dissonance there, because of such a huge portion of our taxes go to military. I think 54% is still allotted to defense and military budgets and things like that. I mean, what's education? 17%? Is it even? No, I think it's 17%? It's about 17%, right? So, but again, if you're in a country, you have to follow the laws of the land. So it's actually prohibited if you come into a country by Sharia, even though the laws are against Islam, you either have to make hijrah or you have to follow those laws. It is prohibited, like it would be prohibited for a Muslim to cheat on the income tax, given that is a law in this country. They would either have to leave or they would have to pay it, because the conditions of coming into the country, one of the conditions is that you'll obey the laws of the land. And the Prophet said, the Qur'an says that fulfill the trust that you have given to its people. So when a person comes into this country with a visa or a green card, and it says you're expected to obey the laws of the land, then you are expected to. So it's actually a breach of Islam not to. And that is something, unfortunately, some Muslims aren't aware of.
I just want to clarify one point. I heard two different things. One, that it cannot be for your own family, and the other, that it's first to be for your own family.
No, it can't be for your own family if it's like a trick. In other words, I give my wife my zakat, she gives me her zakat. No, it's to your family if they're poor and worthy. Then they should be the first recipients. Now the government does have the right, if there was a valid Islamic government, they do have the right to collect zakat. That is a right of the government, and the government would distribute it. In the absence of government gathering of zakat, then it is an individual responsibility on the Muslims.
How do you determine what is a valid government?
Well, any government that has that has the authority is considered valid. If there's it's prohibited to go out against the government. Like revolution is actually prohibited in Islam. In the Sunni tradition, not in the Shia tradition. They do have a difference. I mean, that is an important distinction. The Sunni tradition believes that they have a right to fight and oppose an unjust government, whereas the Sunni tradition says that the people should be patient and ask God to change the conditions and rectify themselves, but they should not actually physically bear arms, because that would lead to a greater tribulation than the actual injustice, which is bloodshed amongst people. So in the Sunni tradition, it's actually like what's happening in Algeria, for instance. That's prohibited by Islamic law to do that. And that is the classical Islamic view. And the group that goes out are called Khawarij, which are the seceders. And you can find them historically. There's always been groups that have said that. But the traditional Sunni position is that you cannot go against the ruler. Any other questions?
When you mention a legitimate Islamic government, would this be a government that has as its ultimate law?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the ideal. But even if they're not implementing the Qur'an and they don't openly say that they don't believe in it, they're still considered the legitimate government.
So they would then have the right to collect these?
Yes.
And this could be in lieu of a welfare department or something like this?
Zakat, that's the whole point of zakat. Yeah, it's to help the poor people. It's a right of the poor people. And it's interesting because the Prophet said, take from your wealthy the zakat and return it to the poor people. So it's almost like, people get rich off poor people because the vast majority of the world's population is poor. I mean, we forget that. We really do have a very high living standard. But the vast majority of the world's population are poor people. And the wealth, even America's wealth, is largely dependent on a lot of, of wealth from other countries. We have very cheap oil in this country. I mean, for example, for a liter of Coke is about how much? I don't buy Coke, but what are you paying there? $1. You're paying more for sugar and water than you are for a liter of oil, right? And sugar and water are pretty much inexhaustible resources. Relatively, I know there's some problems now with water and things like that. Whereas oil, you're dealing with an inexhaustible resource. It's grossly underpriced. Oil is grossly underpriced. I mean, we're paying $1.40 for a gallon of gas. It'll take you 30 miles, 40 miles, and you pay, relatively the same amount for a bottle of sugar water that's going to rot your teeth and give you diabetes, So it's really interesting that oil is so cheap. And oil should probably be around, what's that?
I was saying 4 or 5.
At least. I mean, my father now, that's what he's in. He left teaching and got in because my grandfather was in the oil business, and he got in it through, when he married my mother, he started working in that, and he's always going on about it. Drives him crazy because, he said it should be around at least 50 a barrel or something like that. It's just grossly underpriced. But we have the luxury of having very cheap oil. And the majors, it's hard to believe, but they actually maintain those low prices, And the exploration in this country it's unbelievable how difficult it is to explore oil in this country. There are still lots of oil reserves in this country, and most of the old oil fields of the 1930s and 40s were very shallow. They didn't have the technology to go down several miles. They just would go down very short amounts. But oil it's really discouraged to explore oil in this country, and most of the majors are just not interested anymore. Because they're making so much money off. It's more expensive. It's much cheaper to buy underpriced oil from the Arabian Peninsula than it is to explore and exploit the resources here. Mm-hmm.
I know you want to cover the last couple points here, but let me just clarify one thing. So Muslims in the United States would pay, obviously, the federal and state and city income property taxes that they owe. In addition to that, they pay 2.5%.
Yes. And many of them do and many of them don't. There are many Muslims that don't pay zakat anymore, but there are many that still do, because now it's an individual thing. There are many Muslims in my area. There are about 70,000 Muslims estimated in the Greater Bay Area. Maybe from that 70,000, 8 to 10,000 are actually praying. So, and from that 8 to 10,000 of those praying, there might not be some that are paying zakat. So it's now become more of an individual. I mean, do you think that's a fair estimate, Suleiman? Because you're more familiar with those type numbers than I am. Isn't it? I reason it's about 10% generally within any given population in this country. Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah, that's correct.
So, and Muslims often fall in very high tax brackets in this country because there's a lot of physicians, there's a lot of engineers, so they're paying a lot of taxes, right? Mm-hmm.
In this category, in this zakat category, is that where you were planning to discuss the idea of lending and interest and paying interest in this way? Or is that
That's another, I was going to do that with the Sharia, but I can bring that up now, the idea of just, yeah, let me just get through that. Go ahead.
Okay. No, lost it. I'll come back.
Okay, just when it comes back. Fasting is the next pillar, and that's one lunar year out of the month called Ramadan. It will change. Now it's interesting also to note that the lunar year is basically, it will make a full cycle. In other words, it will go through the solar year one time every 32 years. So if a person average lifespan is somewhere around 65, now it's a little higher in this country, but you're going to be fasting 2 times in all the months of the year. So Ramadan will be in December twice in your lifetime. Now it's very interesting because that's related to a kind of justice as well. Because of the different places on the earth, you will find that Ramadan, for some people it's very long at a given part of the year, and then other people's it's incredibly short. So in England, there are periods where it will be very long, and then there are periods where it'll only be like 7 hours, very short fast. And then in the middle part of the world, it's actually quite reasonable. It's usually around 12 hours if you're near the equator. So in the winter, they're very short days. In the summer, they're long days. Fasting is basically abstaining during the lunar month of Ramadan from food, from drink, including cigarettes, from taking anything past the throat. You can rinse your mouth and things, but anything past the throat breaks the fast. And from sexual, both foreplay and actual full intercourse. So during the month of Ramadan, those things the Muslim is commanded to abstain from, both men and women. In my school, which is the Maliki school, it's not encouraged for children to fast. It's actually discouraged. And if they get older, like around 10, 11, then they can fast if they want to. But it's not considered something that you should force a child to do. So, any questions? Fasting's pretty straightforward. Is there any? Mm-hmm.
There have been some students at my school who, during Ramadan, even though they may have been sick and should have been drinking fluids, didn't drink.
Muslims, you'll generally find, are pretty rigid about that. And that has to do sometimes with not fully understanding the tradition, because if you're diabetic, it's actually prohibited to fast. If a physician thinks that it's harmful, it is prohibited by Sharia, and you would actually be doing something haram in the teaching. You would be doing something prohibited, because preservation of the self is the second, after preservation of religion, it is the second highest priority in the Sharia.
Could you go through the categories of those who are exempt, other than you said diabetics?
Old people, if it's difficult for them. If they're able to, but it's hard, they have a choice. People who are traveling have a choice, but if it's hard, they're encouraged to break it. And if it's extremely hard, undue, then they have to break it. A pregnant woman, a nursing woman, and she can either decide for herself or get a doctor's opinion. And the doctor's opinion would be binding on her. Anyone who has a physical illness, like diabetes, or they have to take medicines regularly throughout the day. Now some scholars have permitted like asthma inhalants, that does not break the fast. There's a difference of opinion about that, but my sheikh gave a religious opinion that it did not break the fast because it went into the lungs. And smoking broke the fast because it was unnecessary, right? Which a smoker would definitely disagree with that.
Soldiers, right?
What's that?
Soldiers.
Good point. Yeah, somebody who was fighting, you know, and they needed their physical strength. Now, you know, Hakim Alijawan, it was kind of became national news because he was fasting during the playoffs, and you know, it would be prohibited really for him to do that, to break his fast, you know, because it's a sport. That's why. If it was a valid job, like it is permissible, for instance, if there was a harvest that had to be done and they could not do it fasting, and they would lose the crop or something like that because of that, some type of situation like that, then it would be actually permissible to do it. I mean,
What are the hours of fast?
Fasting goes from the Fajr prayer, which is dawn, until the sunset prayer. And then you can eat, sleep, and well, you do sleep in the daytime anyway, but you can eat, drink, and have relations with your husband or your wife. It's during the nighttime.
What about getting married?
During Ramadan? You could, absolutely. Prophet got married in Ramadan. Yeah.
Ramadan predates Islam.
The month predates Islam, not the fasting. But the lunar months of Islam predated Islam. What predates Islam is the rites around the Kaaba.
During Ramadan?
No. Ramadan does not predate Islam. Fasting in Ramadan is second year Hijrah. Before that, the Arabs did not fast. And the Qur'an says, fasting has been prescribed upon you just as it was prescribed upon the people before you, in order that you might learn discipline. So it's actually considered a spiritual practice to discipline yourself. Now, if you think about it, people who abstain from for a whole month of not eating during the daylight hours, it gives the body, there is a very strong discipline that goes with that. It's prohibited to backbite at any time. Whether it's a Muslim or a non-Muslim, you are not supposed to talk bad about people. It is prohibited to lie. It's disencouraged to talk a lot, empty talk in Islam. It's just not something encouraged. There's a tradition, the Prophet said, كَرِهَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ الْقِيلَ وَالْقَالَ. Allah dislikes empty gossip. You know. Thoreau said that gossip was good in homeopathic doses.
To head back to a question I'd forgotten earlier, you said if there were a legitimate Muslim government, then zakat could be applied. And I know that a lot of Muslims think there is not, but there are governments that claim they are.
Right.
Correct? Have any of the current governments that claim to be Muslim governments started to collect?
There's zakat. There's some zakat, absolutely, in the Emirates, in Arabia, in different places. They do have zakat, and people can pay it through government. No, they don't have to.
Okay.
Yeah.
But with a legitimate Islamic government, it would be allowed for that government
To do it.
require,
Yes. Yeah.
To require.
Mhm.
Okay. But nowhere requires it currently.
No.
Okay.
Could you explain why Ramadan? Is it when the angel Gabriel?
Okay, good point. Thank you. Yeah. It's Ramadan. The reason Ramadan is the month of fasting is generally it says that this Qur'an was revealed in a blessed time. شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن. The month of Ramadan is the month in which the Qur'an was revealed. Now, the Muslim belief is that the Qur'an came to the first heaven, which is called Sama'ud Dunya, to a place called Baytul Izzah, the abode of dignity or exaltation. And that happened in Ramadan. And the beginning of the revelation began on the 27th of Ramadan. And then over a 23-year period, it is being revealed to the Prophet. And in Ramadan specifically, the Prophet ﷺ said that Jibreel used to go through the Qur'an every month with him, but in Ramadan, he used to go through it every year with him in Ramadan, the entire Qur'an. And then in the last Ramadan of his life, he went through it 2 times, and he knew that was his last year. So the Ramadan is considered a very blessed time for Muslims. And traditionally it's encouraged for people to go out and see the new moon. And the Muslims traditionally went out, sighted the new moon, and you would hear a lot of shouts of joy, Allahu Akbar, in the Muslim cities that go up on the rooftops and things. Mm-hmm.
Is there therefore a connection between the crescent and the star?
The crescent moon, interestingly enough, is a much later. It was the Mamluks that actually introduced the crescent moon. And I think it actually, it was a symbol of some of the ancient moon cults. It's become to be adopted as a symbol, but it's in no way an authoritative symbol of Islam. Muslims, it's like an urf, what they call a custom. And the Prophet said whatever the Muslims see as good is good with Allah. So there's an idea that the crescent moon has kind of been accepted by the Muslims but it's not from the Prophet Muhammad. It's an interesting thing about Islam is the absence of symbols, like icons and things. There really is. You go into a mosque and calligraphy is pretty much, and then you have a lot of geometric, which is later. But there's just an absence of a type of iconography or something like that. Mm-hmm.
I've heard it said that the Shahada is a symbol for Islam, written. Somebody said that.
It's traditionally the Prophet did put it on his flag, and so it traditionally has been like. But again, when I mean symbol, I mean more like an abstract, not so much language. Language is symbols, obviously, but I mean like a cross or the Star of David or the Om Simbu statues. In traditions you have a lot of symbols. Like Hindu tradition has many symbols. The Christians have the Stations of the Cross. In a lot of Catholic churches, you'll see those type things. So finally, Hajj. Now, just about the fasting, I would say that traditionally the Muslims viewed fasting as a time of discipline. You should control your talk, your speech, not talk a lot. Learn to control the sexual appetite. Learn to control the tongue. It was very important. The Prophet said in a tradition, whoever guarantees for me what's between his two jaws and his two thighs, I guarantee him paradise. In other words, if you could break those two desires and really discipline yourself in those two things, then, and it's interesting the symbolic relationship between the mouth and the genitals. It's fascinating. There's been a lot of traditions that have examined that, the idea of the createdness, that the mouth is like a womb and the tongue is like a male organ, that there's a type of, that language is a type of created, it's an aspect of creativity. There's an impregnation that takes place from the mind of thought that emerges in the child of speech and things like that. So there's some fascinating relationships there. Let's see. Hajj. Hajj, the pillar of Hajj is the fifth pillar, and I think it's really wonderful to me that of all the pillars of Islam, even though all of these pillars are based on ability, zakat, if you're not able to pay it, you don't pay it. Fasting, if you're not able to fast, you don't fast. Even the prayer, if you're not able to pray standing, you pray reclining. If you're not able to pray reclining, you pray just with your eyes. If you're not able to do that, you pray in your consciousness. If you're not able to do that, you don't have to pray. But yet the Hajj is the only one in the Qur'an where it says, لِلَّهِ عَلَى النَّاسِ حَجُّ الْبَيْتِ لِمَنْ اسْتَطَاعَ إِلَيْهِ سَبِيلًا. Allah, it is incumbent upon mankind or humankind the pilgrimage to His house for whoever is able to make the journey. Even though all the other ones it's the same stipulation, but in that one the stipulation is mentioned. And I think part of that is because the vast majority of Muslims will never be able to make the Hajj. And so it's kind of like just the fact that it was mentioned in there, that there's kind of an ease with that. And this is why the example that you made about people fasting, even though they don't have to, they'll still do it. Really. Whereas the Hajj, there is definitely a limitation there related to wealth, physical capacity, borders, even now. For some people they can't, like for a long time the Russian Muslims could not make pilgrimage. The communist government would not let them make pilgrimage. So there's limitations, and yet right there in the Qur'an it says, for whoever's able to do it. The vast majority of Muslims will never do that. If you look, there's about 1 billion estimated Muslims. Every year, the maximum I could imagine pilgrimage being is maybe 4 million people. Right now it reaches about 3 million. And you are packed. You're like this doing some of the rites. There's so many people. And it's very interesting. I've made pilgrimage 3 times, and I've made Umrah several times. But the actual pilgrimage, first thing, it's related to the ritual of Abraham. The Muslims believe that Abraham took his son Ishmael to the valley of Becca or Mecca. It's also called Becca in the Quran, Mecca and Becca. And he was commanded to leave his maidservant Hajar and Ishmael in that place. It's a barren place. And then he left them. There's what the tradition says is that Hajar, who was she was an African woman who was the mother of Ishmael, that she went into a state of anxiety about the place because there was no water, nothing. And she began to run between these 2 hills, Safa and Marwa. And she did that 7 times, worrying about her baby. And on the 7th time, the well of Zamzam emerged. And there's a well there that still to this day feeds the pilgrims of Mecca. And she drank from the well, and then some people there who were passing through helped them, and they become established. And Abraham comes back when Ishmael is becoming a man and builds with him the house in Mecca. This is what the tradition says. Builds with him the Kaaba. Now some say that the Kaaba was first built by Adam, alayhi salam. And some say that Adam and Hawa met on the plain of Arafah, which is, the word Arafah means to recognize. And it's where they recognize each other after the garden on the earth. Allah Ta'ala alam. Allah knows best about those things. But the basic idea is that the Kaaba was the first house established for the worship of one God only. And Ibrahim built the house, and it's a cube, very simple structure. Nothing there. And then the rites that are related to it is you enter into a ritual state which is called ihram. For a woman, it's taking a bath and dressing in her normal dress. Women tend to wear white on the Hajj. They don't have to, but they tend to, just as a tradition. The man enters into what's called ihram, which is 2 pieces of cloth, a loin cloth, and then a cloth over him. It can have no stitching. It's woven, but it cannot have stitching by hand. Because you're supposed to completely, it's like, it represents complete impoverishment before God, and everybody has to be the same. And so it's encouraged that everybody looks the same. The rich man, the poor man, the free man, the bondsman, everybody, the king, the pauper, everybody becomes the same. And that's the idea, that humanity before God is equal. There's absolutely no differences. And so even in clothes, a rich man, you cannot wear rings. You cannot wear any display of worldly wealth. So somebody who normally wears jewelry, they have to take it all off. So you wouldn't know, you see a person, you don't know if they're rich, they're poor, you don't have a clue. They just look the same as you do. And so the idea is literally that humanity completely strips themselves of any of their social accruement, social status. And they go there before God equal. And the first ritual is you enter into the place of Mecca, and you go to the house and you do a circumambulation 7 times. You go around the house 7 times, which according to the tradition is what Ibrahim did, and then the Prophet ﷺ purified and renewed it again. So after going around the house, you will kiss the black stone. The black stone is a stone that's been identified as a meteorite, but traditionally it was believed that it came from heaven, and originally it was white and became black from the wrong actions of people that touched it. And you go and you kiss the stone, and the Prophet said the stone is it's like the right hand of God on the earth. In other words, it's symbolic, like you go and kiss the hand of the king or the Pope. For the Catholics, they would kiss the ring. that there you go and you kiss the stone as a symbol of being invited to the house of the king. And you kiss the stone, and then you pray 2 rakats or 2 prostrations at the place of Ibrahim. It's called Maqamu Ibrahim, where Abraham built the house. And there is an actual place, a maqam, and there are 2 footprints in there that are traditionally considered to be the footprints of Abraham. And then at that point you go, you drink from the well of Zamzam, and you make prayer. It's a good place to make prayer. And then you go to Safa and Marwa, and you go between them 7 times. And there's a period where you actually do a quick run. It's not a sprint, but like a jog, which symbolizes Hajj's running through that area. And then after the 7th time you've completed that, you go to Mina. And Mina is a place where you prepare for Arafat. So you clean yourself again, and then the next morning you set out for Arafat. You will spend the day at Arafat. It's a plain that is considered to be a preparation for the Day of Judgment. You're literally preparing for the day when all of humanity is before God in a nonlinear sense, no front, back, right? It's not anthropomorphic, but is before God and goes naked, stripped of all of their worldly distinctions, and you ask for forgiveness. And so the prayer of Arafat is to ask forgiveness of God, to come. It's very powerful because you are literally seeing humanity there. I mean, I've been to the Vatican at times when there's a lot of people. I haven't been to any of these Hindu gatherings, but I've never seen anything like it in the sense that literally there are Chinese people, there are Indonesians, there are Malay people, there are African people, there are black Africans, there are white Africans, there are Turkic people, there are European people, now there are American people, there are Mongolians, there are Chinese from different places in China, there are Cambodians, there are Thai people, Vietnamese people, Filipino people. People literally coming. It says in the Qur'an they will come from every deep crevice. They will come from every valley, and they will come to this place, and they're all there. You just see the whole thing. You see sick people, you see healthy people, you see people crawling, you see people being carried. Some people literally carry other people on their backs. You see people carrying their parents. So it's just a very, very overwhelming experience to enter into that sacred space. And the great reminder on that day, the verse that was quoted when the Prophet made Hajj, there was a black man who gave the adhan. And the Arabs looked down on, they had this racism, and they looked down on it and they said, they asked why that man was giving the call to prayer. And so the verse came down that we have created you in peoples and tribes to know one another. So the idea is people come there really to learn. It's a little difficult. I'm kind of getting back into that space, so just excuse me for a second. Hajj, for some reason, I just have a hard time talking about because I've been there, and I've had the experience, and they start coming back to me, that experience in that place. But so I'll just try to get over this. The verse just said that, we have created you in peoples and tribes to know one another, and it says the noblest in the eyes of God are the most conscientious. In other words, the one thing that the Prophet said on the Hajj pilgrimage was there is no preference over a white man or a black man or a black man over a white man. So the idea is just to eliminate this insidious aspect of human nature, which is the idea that some people are superior to others. And when you see everybody in that same condition, the nomad and the sedentary, the rich and the poor, and they're all just there in that same basic human condition, that we are bereft and we are poor before God. It's very powerful as a reminder, that beware of considering yourself above this person next to you. because of something incidental like color, or because of something like wealth, or because of something like beauty, or because of something like lineage, that in that place, all of those things disappear and you're just like everybody else. You are a naked creature that has to eat, sleep, and defecate, and urinate, and menstruate, and procreate, and do all these things, and there's something very basic and fundamental to your humanity. So the Hajj really does, and what I've noticed with people who make the Hajj is there is often a very powerful transformation that occurs in their life. It really is a very transformative experience. You are not the same person. You don't look at other people the same way, and there's just a transformation. And traditionally they said if a person comes back worse from Hajj, bad sign. They said either he went there with the wrong intention or it wasn't accepted for whatever reason. So the idea is that Hajj is really a time when you complete it, that it's your life's journey and you're ready to die. And that really is a kind of completion. So those are the 5 pillars, and that's a very quick and general overview. So what time is it now? Oh, it's 12:15? So I went over. We started late. Now you can't do that when there's bells and things, right? So any quick questions? The Hajj only lasts for 4 days. Yeah, and it's actually 3, and then there's the last.
Can you explain the part of the Hajj where they throw stones?
Good, yeah, I forgot about that. There is a point where, according to Abraham, the tradition, Abraham was like tempted by Satan or Shaitan, and he cast stones. And the idea, the Muslims believe in an entity called Iblis, which is where we get Diablos, and or Shaitan. And Shaitan in Arabic means from Shaitana, which means to take people away from or to distance people. And the idea is that there is an entity whose role and function is to attempt to distance people from God, to separate them from God. And there are 2 types of shayateen. There are human ones, and there are ones that are in the unseen realm. The human ones, according to the Prophet, are worse. Right? Human, like warmongers, people like that. People that they thrive off creating. There's actually people that will want to create wars between other people. It's kind of hard to imagine, but there's people that make a lot of money doing things like that, and they derive a lot of benefit. So, and it's also, I really consider in a lot of ways there's a lot of people with, I read this thing called Ad Week, which is really, I would really recommend if you're teaching any social studies or sociology type courses to get your students to read that magazine. Because I think it really wakes them up to the idea of manipulation within their culture. The fact that there are people manipulating them at very serious and psychological levels. And Ad Week is a magazine that it's very hard to find in your average store. You can get it at very good places where they have almost all the magazines. And it's a magazine designed for people who are advertisers. It's not a consumer magazine, it's designed for people. And the interesting thing about the magazine is that the commodity being sold is human beings. That's what's so fascinating. When they put the ads out, what they're trying to sell you is an audience. And they'll guarantee you a certain percentage of sales from that audience. And they really bring really interesting things. Like they had one where last month's Ad Week, and I'm interested just because I'm very interested in media and I'm interested in education. I really think that the media has been very effective at educating people in a certain way. But they had one that said that the recent study that they did, the psychologists showed that American men, that their number one sexual fantasy was with nurses. And what they said was that this was very useful for advertisers because they could have like a beer commercial where a nurse comes in with a beer and the man's in the bed and they don't have to do anything overt. But for that group out there that happens to think that would be an interesting thing to explore, there would be a type of what they call anchoring. in the subconscious, right? And so there's a sexual stimulation related to that type of beer. And this is the type of thing, I mean, they really do this stuff, this type of research. And I think to just empower young people, to let them know that really that there are forces out there that do try to manipulate them for their own good, and to kind of become aware of that so that they're not such victims, that they kind of get a type of critical analysis. Another really useful book was a PhD dissertation done, and I can't remember her name, but it's called Decoding Advertisements, which is a lot about, and it's not, there's some real crazy type about a lot of the real, subliminal type things that I think go a little too far. They start reading things in that just aren't there. But these are more done at they're academics. This is a very serious academic study of trying to understand really what's behind the whole ideology of advertisement. So, any other questions? Uh-huh.
Could you just tell when they
Oh, so what? Thank you. I got off. I'm a tangent. Go off on these tangents. What you do is you pick up these stones, 21 stones, and then you throw 7 stones at these 3 pillars. And it's a purely symbolic thing. And unfortunately, some of these hajis get a little out of hand and they start thinking that really is the devil, right? So you get some stones. And there was a hadith in which a man was throwing big stones, and the Prophet said, beware of going to extremes in your religion. The Prophet actually hated extremism. He really did. He did not he was very wary of extremes. He was a very balanced person. He said, my way is the middle way. He did not like people that were fasting all the time. He said, I eat and I fast. He did not like people who abstained from sexual relations. He said, I have sexual relations. He did not like people that stayed up all night. He said, I pray and I sleep. So he really was very wary. He saw one time there was a rope in the mosque tied to the wall, and he asked what it was, and he said, so-and-so put that for when they fell asleep, that it would keep them up. And he said, take it down and tell them not to do that. He saw another man who swore that he would stay in the sun until such and such happened, and he would fast. And the Prophet told him, said, tell him to get out of the sun, and just finish his fast for the day, but not to go into the sun. So he was very against extremes. And so you're supposed to pick up very small pebbles and literally just throw them like this. It's not supposed to be like, whoosh, So people take sandals and throw. I mean, it gets a little crazy. The throwing is actually probably the hardest part of Hajj, because people do get a little out of control. And then you're dealing with a lot of, unfortunately from the Muslim world, you're getting a lot of people coming out of very ignorant backgrounds. A lot of them don't know their tradition. They haven't learned the rules of Hajj. So you have a lot of things. But it's amazing, given the amount of people, given the space, given the intensity, there are very, very rarely any incidents of, I have never heard of any outright violent incidences where people actually, other than I think there were some riots that the Iranians during the whole Iranian Revolution did. But my 3 times on the Hajj, if somebody starts getting angry, there's all these people around them just tell them, be patient, you're on Hajj, and they remind them and things like that. And people respond to that. And the same is true in Ramadan. You're fasting, just relax and calm down.
Can you explain that feast at the end?
It symbolizes that Abraham, alayhi salam, that when he was told to kill his son, what the Jewish tradition calls the Akedah tradition, that it was replaced with a ram. And there's a difference of opinion in the Muslim tradition whether it was Isaac or Ishmael. I think most Muslims now believe that it was Ishmael, but early on the Prophet never said which child it was. And it's not really considered important it's not essential to the story. The importance is the act of submission. And what you do is you celebrate by sacrificing a ram preferably, or some other animal, and then distribute that meat to poor people and things like that. Mm-hmm. And other Muslims take part in that around the world. Even though the Hajis are doing it, other Muslims, like in Santa Clara, people will go out and they will sacrifice on that day. Many people, and it's encouraged to do that. Any other? So I think that ends the session on Islam, and I hope that was beneficial, and thanks for your attention.